Why buy your next vehicle from Community Motors of Mason City?
Great service from 3 locations: Community on Monroe, Community Motors Westside, and Mason City Ford. 10 new franchises and hundreds of vehicles to give you more choices. Plus, Community offers an exclusive 3-3 warranty on pre-owned vehicles and 10-year, 250,000-mile warranty on new. Need more reasons why? Stop or visit CommunityAutoGroup.com.
'Cause nobody beats a community deal, nobody.
Multi-purpose center presentation, and Mr. Trout and his staff have done a very good job of taking what the committee have done and move it to the next level. And we'll let Mr. Trout present. Thank you very much for putting all this together for us.
You're welcome, Mayor, Council. On behalf of staff, I'll make a presentation tonight on what we found, reference the next steps for the multi-purpose center. Go ahead, Kevin. We know, just a quick review, the Citizen Task Force took a look at this. They reviewed, meeting with many of the different stakeholders that are involved with the project. Came together, did interviews, determined what the needs were based off of different information that they received. They completed their report in May, and then council ended up deciding to have, based off of their work, have staff take a look at it. We had a number of issues going on that prevented us from being able to get started on it right away, but we were able to move forward with the project and conduct both meetings with local architects, with JLG Architects, which is a company out of the Minneapolis area, and then also go and tour 3 different facilities up in the Minneapolis area that helped us understand what challenges they had when they looked at their projects and the types of projects that they had. 3 completely different projects, so it was a very good trip. The committee consisted of the City Finance Officer, Kevin Jacobson, Growth Development Planning Director, Pam Myrie, Brian Pauley, Interim Recreation Director, and the late Chuck McGreevy, Building Official. So we went through the process, and go back one, please. From that, I can say that we feel that the information that we were given and provided was the information that went a little deeper than what the task force had. But I can tell you that by no means are we experts in providing feasibility studies or any of that. But we did utilize, I think, sound information presented to us by those other communities and the architects that we met with to be able to give you the information that we are tonight. Next slide. The information that we have is we're looking at a project that runs $14 to $16 million to do phase 1, which is basically 1 sheet of ice, 2,500 seats on a fixed basis, and then allowing another 1,000 if you were to have a multi-use concert type event where you could sit on the floor, and that would give you 3,500 seating. Obviously, this would be one of the largest facilities in our area. You would have to go quite a ways to find a facility this big. You'd be looking at the Rochester area before you would find something comparable. From that, one of the needs that we had that was identified by the Citizen Task Force was the fact that a second sheet of ice was really necessary. When we looked at the users that we had in the professional hockey team, the college hockey team, high school hockey team, and all the junior youth hockey teams that we have, then you throw in figure skating, some of the older, some of the mature hockey players that have events. We found that there was a need, they found that there was a need for a second sheet of ice. So, and then the other idea that they had was that the sport courts. So what we found in the other facilities was the second sheet of ice had a minimal amount of seating. It was really a practice rink. But when you have tournaments, there's a need to have that extra seating that goes along with that second sheet of ice. So that was determined to be an important part of our discussion. We found that, and you see in the recommendation, that to do phase A and phase B at the beginning is really the right answer if you can afford it, because the cost to do the additional sheet of ice is minimal compared to the initial cost to do the first. And that's because you can share the ice equipment in order to make the ice and keep the ice set up. It's a reduced level type of seating, so the additional cost with the seating is not as great. The other issue that was identified was, and we call Phase C, relates to gymnasium space, basically. It's the ability to play basketball and other types of indoor sports, creating a floor that could be used for many types of activities. Desirable, but as you'll see down the road, we're now with the cost, I don't know that it's feasible, but that's kind of getting ahead of myself, sorry. Next slide. Here's the drawing. It's hard to see up here, but there's Phase A. That's your 2,500 seating all around, basic U-shaped seating. Multi-purpose, you would buy flooring that would go on the ice, could go on the ice. You could take the ice out if you wanted to, or put flooring down on top of the ice, have an event. You could put, say we had a very big basketball game that we wanted to play, we could own a flooring that would allow us to have a regional basketball event here, or other type of sport needed a floor like that. Or you take everything, just leave a flooring down and have a stage set up in this area, and then you have seating on the floor for a really nice sized concert. We think that would be something that would be encouraging for certain performers to have this type of facility. The surf ball room is 1,200 to 1,500, right in that neighborhood for their seating. NIAC is just right around 1,000. So this would be one big step above what we have already within the community. And there's the second phase, which is the ice rink, the second ice rink, and the sport courts. Next slide. I should say the first slide that you had there was our facility in an urban area utilizing existing parking. One of the sites that's been mentioned that was presented by Berglund and Cram was the site south of Willow Creek that is parking area for Principal. That would be one area that you would have existing parking you could utilize with it, and so that reduces the amount of parking that you need, plus other types of transportation assets that bring people in. This then looks at a area that is basically, it's not rural. That was what we first looked at. It's basically an undeveloped site, an area that's big spread out, no existing parking. You would have to take a lot of additional land. You're looking at, I believe it was 13.4 acres to do that large area for something that sets out on its own. So it's important to remember that there's additional space. 5.5 acres if we're doing it in an area in the urban environment. So quite a bit of difference in needs for property. A lot of times though you have redevelopment issues if you're looking at the area in the urban area. Next slide. So we've established that the need for the second sheet of ice exists. Bad Nice Heights created a sports arena. They're similar to what we feel we would be from the standpoint of use of the facility. They currently have a hockey program that's similar to what we used to have here, Twin City Steel. It's in AHL, so it's a step up from what we have now, or maybe even two. Can't remember, Jerry, but anyway, much more experienced players, better team. They have a hockey team that is from a college, and they have their high school hockey team. So they created 2 sheets of ice right from the get-go. And they have only 3 or 4 hours, staff we asked, and there's only 3 or 4 hours that they see nobody on one sheet of ice. There's almost always somebody on one sheet, and there's only about 3 or 4 hours that there isn't somebody else on it. So they have a lot of the same type of needs. That's why we think that the second sheet of ice is critical based off of the users that we see coming and utilizing this facility. The other 2 facilities that we went to, one is pretty much dedicated to hockey, the Egan facility. And the Egan facility is 2 sheets of ice. They added the second one after they'd already built the first one. And they do multi-purpose type facility actions on the second sheet. And so they're using it similar to what we would look at, although they don't have concerts and that type of thing typically in their facility. But they do trade shows and other types of events, and they run them themselves, and they're able to generate some good revenue in the off months when hockey is needed. So the last facility was Chaska, right? that's the name of the town, yeah, Chaska. Theirs was more of a overall fitness type facility, which had one sheet of ice and then added a second one. They also have indoor pool, they have basketball floors, they have, it's basically like a Y, an expanded Y with 2 sheets of ice, and so it's a little different usage of facility, but bottom line is they have enough activity in their facility for youth hockey and other things that they needed the second sheet of ice. So here's an example. The JLG designed this building, and as you can see, it's similar in type of size of what we would have for their seating, and it gives you an impression of what type of facility could look like for the ice hockey. Next slide. Our financing options for construction. A lot of money to be spent if we were to do this facility. I looked at these sources, donations and fundraising. Obviously, we would look at naming rights, other types of donations for people that are interested in the facility, partnering with youth hockey and some other organizations to generate as much fundraising as we could for the facility, first of all. Second, tax increment financing. With a change, which we are considering, given current law, we can spend tax increment financing to support a public facility building such as this. And from our analysis, there's a large chunk of money that is there relative to TIF financing. You discussed the impacts of TIF financing. You will have an impact on your general fund operating budget if you pursue this facility with tax increment financing. But that would be something that we would make a lot of changes within our budget in order to support. But the good news is that we would be utilizing all the possibilities we have with financing, and the other taxing bodies here would be helping us to have this facility. So it would give us a better resource for paying for the project. General obligation bonds is an asset, it is an option. Anything over $700,000 though requires public vote, and so that is something that could be a limiting factor if there was not support in the public side for looking at that as an option. Lease purchase, I've talked to a company, which I included information in your packet, Public Financial Investment Corporation. They've done almost 100 projects across the nation where they lease purchase the facility. We would sign an agreement with them, and they would build it and then own it, and then we would make a payment at the end of 20 or 30 years, depending on what we would negotiate. In the end, we would end up owning it. We could use any of these other sources to do the lease purchase, but there are options that help with regards to hurting us on our debt limit. And if we structure the lease purchase correctly, it won't count against our annual appropriation amount, our debt service limit, and we turn it into an annual appropriation instead. Now, there are limits. Kevin's talked to the bonding attorneys, and there are restrictions on how we can set that up, and it has to be done a specific certain way in order to qualify. So it is a limiting factor that we'll have to get the attorneys involved in order to do this. Local option sales and service tax, if passed again in November, this is a recreational type facility. That's what we've utilized in the past. Some portions of the funds for local option service sales tax, and so that would be something that we could tap into if desired. And the hotel motel tax. The information provided by the City of Waterloo shows that there's a significant increase in the number of hotels that are rented because of the types of activities that would be held in this facility. And so we feel that it's going to generate new dollars in the hotel motel tax. And so that's something that could be a funding source for the construction, putting a certain number of dollars in if desired. Here's a scenario that I went through for the financing. $3 million in fundraising, looking at $16.3 million that would be tax increment financing, $700,000 in general obligation bonds, and then a local option sales and service tax commitment of $100,000 per year. The numbers that I used based off analysis of impact that Waterloo has had, this is not a hard figure to reach based off of the additional funds that would be spent in our community if this type of facility was opened and run. So this would then generate the $21 million to fund the project. That's what is probably the lowest price if you do phase A and phase B. So you end up with 2 sheets of ice. That's the approximate cost you have. Next slide. The lease payment option, the way it works, city enters in an agreement to lease, purchase the project, and then, as you can tell, they build it, and we begin to make the payments, and we would determine what way, based off those other items, any of those other items that we listed as financing options could be utilized in order to make the payments. And then at the end of the lease purchase, the city gains ownership. It's pretty basic, but we've done smaller lease purchases in the past for the city, but with our ambulance and so forth, but this is obviously a much bigger project issue. Next slide. Financing. First of all, I think that when we're trying to raise the amount of money that we're looking at, we really probably need to get a professional involved to help us determine appropriate amounts for what naming rights and other types of portions of the building should be running, and then have somebody that's out looking. I think we'll have better success. I have experience with a little bit of that in Boone when we did a major project down there. They used a professional, and it made a big difference in our ability to reach out and touch all the potential donors that we might have for a facility. Secondly, the primary source that I'm recommending at this point is tax increment financing, based off of the discussions that I've been feeling from council through the whole budget process, to consider the issues that we just went through with general obligation bond amounts that we're talking about. We don't want to pass that cost on to the taxpayers in a general obligation bond way. Obviously, we have to be voted on, and I'm not sure that everyone in that amount would support it. It would be, but also because it would have such a dramatic impact on their property taxes, it would be something that would be, I think, difficult for everybody to stomach. Looking at tax increment financing as being another alternative that makes it less painful. We make adjustments to our operating budgets to handle if we have a desire to build this project. That's the base of the bottom line. If possible, the lease purchase option, I think, has a lot of merit. The biggest issue is if we can construct it right, instead of having $16 million that goes against our debt capacity, we can structure $1 million or $1.5 million against that debt capacity. It continues to give us flexibility in the future should something occur. The amount that we have to pay doesn't change, but it gives us flexibility that if something major happens, we have still the ability to sell general obligation bonds to meet that something that might happen. Even from the flood, we didn't have to do anything, but you don't know. You get a tornado that comes through town and destroys buildings, and insurance doesn't cover this or that. There'd be bonding issues that we might have to address. So the lease purchase option, if we can structure it right, I think is your best option for doing the building. Next slide. A couple pictures. Marion, Indiana. They've just approved and are working on a project, sports and entertainment center, similar type of project. A little more expensive. They're like 4,500 seats, I believe. But this is an example of the design views of what it might look like, both at dusk and dawn. So, operations, another big issue we have to deal with. If you have 2 sheets of ice, my recommendation is not to utilize the recreation department to run it. We're in the process of moving into the Washington facility. There are better options for our staff to utilize that facility. And the other thing is we're going to look at hiring personnel to operate this facility anyway. So if there's not sport courts down there where they can do programming, better not to move them, because they can do programming at the Washington school. Now that lease is structured that should we decide to do something here, we can get out of that lease for this type of particular project. That's a clause that's in our lease, so we're not stuck there if we do something like this. Really just looking at a superintendent, concessions person as being full-time people. Waterloo runs 3 full-time people, and for them, I think it's working. All the facilities that we went to use part-time people to do the work on the ice, running the Zamboni, and then also doing the maintenance within the facility. They're using part-time people because their events fluctuate here and there, so there really isn't a need to have a full-time person doing maintenance every day. But there is maintenance that has to be done every day on the ice, so they bring in the people they need, do the work, and then move on. The multi-purpose center superintendent would would manage the facility, help with booking, establishing who's using the ice when, but I would not recommend that they get involved in trying to recruit the different types of events that we want to have, your concerts and those types of things. They could work on the trade shows and some of that, but getting the big name people, we need to get somebody like Venue Works, which has been mentioned before through the whole process, that has the contacts and people that can bring in those big names that we would like to see, which then adds value to the structure so that our citizens don't have to go out of town to attend some of those same types of events. Next slide. This is an example of a facility in Fargo doing a multi-purpose type use, having a trade show and having a convention and going around and having to set up everything. They've obviously taken the ice out and they're using it for this type of facility. Next slide. And these are some of the other types of events that you end up with, concerts and monster truck stuff, and rodeos. I mean, there's just an endless opportunity for the number of types of facilities or types of events that you can have in this type of facility. So, next slide. Most critical issue, controlling those labor costs and utilities. We know from discussion that we had with Bad Nice Heights, they had a couple of issues in their design, work that wasn't completed, and that a lot of their ice or their heat was escaping, and they were running their utilities, and they made a change, put a door in, and they were able to cut $10,000 per month off their utility expense. Utilities are a huge, huge issue with this kind of facility. So those are the two critical issues that we need to be paying attention to. These are the numbers that we worked. This is 2 full-time personnel plus the part-time personnel to maintain the facility. Utility estimate and the cost to do improved fixing of the ice system as needed. Building and grounds maintenance, other expenses, sales tax, and concession supplies. These numbers were created off of the budget that we had from Waterloo and the type of facility that we expect to run. We went through them, and this is what we feel is probably realistic somewhat. When you look at the revenues, it's conservative on the revenue. I think this ice time rent could be much higher than that from the standpoint of that we've never had 2 sheets of ice in town. I went conservative on how much it would actually be rented. And if you do the math, 6 days a week, 2 sheets of ice, and they're used over 10 hours at $100 an hour, I mean, it adds up pretty fast if we can get full people. And $100 an hour is a cheap rate. So it could add up much faster than this. But this includes the ice time agreement with the professional hockey team, with the college hockey team, with the high school, and with the youth sports. So I think that this number potentially could be higher, but I don't know. I don't have enough information, because I can tell what, and I included it in there, what the fairgrounds has for ice time, and it's booked 6 o'clock until 10 o'clock every day, except for one day in their schedule is booked. The thing that you don't know is how many hours would each of those people expand their usage of ice if they had it available. How much are they being restricted now just because everybody needs to get on there? We think that they'll fill up that second ice sheet at a time, but I don't want to go too far with regards to our revenues. Concession, wow, $570,000 a year is what Young Arena makes on concessions. So I'm not even pushing the limit here on this. So it is substantial. They sell a lot of beer and a lot of concessions, and they, as I put in my thing, they have 30 games in a year, and the Bulls run out here right now, run 24 home games. Waldorf is doing 10 home games, and so there's 4 more games for us, but whether or not it's a smaller arena, that's the other thing we got to look at. Our projected arena would be 1,000 seats, fixed seats, less than what Young Arena has. So that's why I backed this down. We're not going to get as many people through the door, even though we have 4 more games. We're probably not going to get as many people through the door. But I still feel that number is conservative. It could be even greater. The markup that is held on those types of concessions is substantial. They're spend 170 and make almost 570. So the other arena, that's strictly looking at other types of events. Usually what they do is they pay a flat fee to rent, which takes care of any maintenance expenses that we have when you have an event in there. So and I put in the report having, that's 4 concerts, 2 other types of events, and 4 trade shows. So it's not really stretching what could be within that facility. Obviously, advertising revenue is a big deal for all of the facilities that we went to. People put their logos on the ice, on all the boards around, banners hanging in the facilities, so you can generate some good amount of money from the advertising in the facility. In public skate, we found in Eagan, they make almost 20 grand a year just on public skate and skate shark. So I think that it's an untapped market. I don't know how much public skate goes on here, but I think that if more hours and more flexible hours were created, that this should be an easy amount to reach. However, by doing all those things conservative that I did, I still show adding $10,000 from a hotel motel tax. Based on the numbers that Young Arena has generated for hotel motel tax increases because of events happening, I feel that it's fair to utilize $10,000 from the hotel motel tax, transferring that back into support in order to balance the budget out. $10,000 is all I need, and if any of these do better, we're in good shape. So, as you can see, I tried to do as conservative as possible in order to accomplish it. So, oh, there's a lot of the things that I mentioned already. The other option is one other option that is mentioned with regards to operating. If the council would choose, there is a levy that council can approve of 13.5 cents per thousand evaluation that can be used to operate a civic center, which this would qualify under the definition that they have for civic center. So we could do that. It generate 137 a year. It would increase everybody's tax to $7, and that's something that if we look at the amount of money you would save by even just have to attend one event, and you more than save your $7 for having to drive out of town. You can't get very far on that. So you're doing a pretty good job. But right now, I don't see with the way I did the numbers on the previous slide that we need to impose this. But if we started running into problems with the other revenues, this is one that would be available to us. The city of Ottumwa currently uses it, and I don't know of any others, but the city of Ottumwa currently uses it to help with their costs related to their center. TIF districts. Most of ours are going to sunset in 9 years. And we're already working on doing the consolidation. That's coming down the road. And so we'll put some numbers together. Also within operation, when those sunset, there's an extra $600,000 or $700,000 that's going to come back on our tax rolls, back into our general fund when we're no longer utilizing it for TIF. That's if we were utilizing the full amount. I should say that correctly. That's if we were utilizing every TIF dollar that we have, that would be the amount. We're not doing that, so depending unless we changed and have some other type of project, or we did this project, this number is less that comes back to us. So if you did want to, what I was commenting on is you would be able to look at utilizing general fund to transfer after those would sunset in 9 or 10 years. A lot of other options, that's really the last resort, but I needed to throw it out there. There is something that if it wasn't working, we could transfer general fund dollars back to cover it, as a number of the communities that we've looked at do. Can utilize TIF. Pam called, and it is one of those things you could utilize TIF for operations. Probably not a good idea, but looking at all options, that is still available. And the other idea I like is looking at creating a sinking fund, putting a per ticket fee for each event that we might have there. That we create a sinking fund so that when they need to do capital projects at the facility, we create a fund so they don't come and ask the city council for, well, we need $100,000 to do this project. Start the sinking fund, and then when they come up with a project they need, because that's what happened to Young Arena. Young Arena was actually expanding their locker rooms when we were down there in order to support the USHL hockey team that they have down there. So it is something, if we start doing that, everybody's 50 cents a ticket, it'll add up pretty quick, and then they won't have to come back to us looking for money to develop the project. mentioned this already. In summary, it's based off of the uses, we're looking at 2 sheets of ice and sport courts, and these are the dimensions of what we would have at the facility if we did the whole thing. And we covered all those areas, but we would need really some guidance from the city council on if we move forward on what the fundraising goals, then that would help establish how the rest of the trickle down of the financing of the project would occur. My recommendation to the city council at this point is to continue to pursue this. I think that there are enough information here that from what we've generated, there is a need for the project. We can find a way to finance it, and we feel that the operations can support itself, more or less. It's hard to say specifically, but it could support itself. I think that we need to look forward and look at potentially doing a feasibility study to verify the information that we've generated to help confirm that we're going down the right track. And studying the revenues and expenses that would be there with operating the facility in more detail in order to make sure that we didn't miss something on that. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Trout. That's great. You and your folks did a great job. All right, guys.
We're all here to answer questions too, if you have.
Well, I think that initially, I think we need to kind of go through and just kind of get your thoughts and your questions out of the way. And then if we have desire for direction, then we can pin down direction, whether it's further research, feasibility, when or how you do public input, kind of get that ball rolling. Thoughts and questions, Mr. Lee.
First off, I would like to say with such a big project, I love the idea. I think it's something this community could really use. But no matter what we decide, I think it's absolutely positively necessity that the public gets a vote on this one. I know in some regards they have to, in some ways we can work around it. I remember, and I hate to say the campaign, but when I said, I remember on record that I would do anything in my power for citizens to vote on this. And so I'm absolutely advocating for that, if there's a way to do that. But I just quickly did some numbers. You said $205,000 on rental, but you said from 6 in the morning to 10 at night, they're booked for 6 nights a week, that's 72 hours. A week, that's times 100. Actually, that comes up to be about $375,000 if we don't add any time, roughly.
Right.
So I do see where you really lowballed that, so thank you. I like the conservative nature. But one concern I have is, I don't mean to offend any hockey people here, but we're not Eagan. We're not Minneapolis. I know I have students, I have friends who are diehard hockey, but we don't have the number of diehard hockey as, I'd like to see a comparable study if this continues to go forward of one instead of the middle of Nebraska or Missouri or something. That's more equivalent to us, not Minneapolis. That's a concern I have. Kind of apples to apples, I suppose, would be one thing to talk about. And I think I have some other comments, maybe questions, but I want to see where other people stand. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee.
I want to add, I have, Councilman Lee, I have been in conversations with the owner of this current team, and they do have a desire that if we built this facility, they would be interested in being a tenant.
And I saw that.
Yeah, and I think that for me, that shows that we do have some support for the hockey. It may not be as great as the other, communities you mentioned, but in the Minneapolis area, but it's surprising the number.
No, I agree. We have a very strong nucleus of hockey.
Whether it's enough, I think that's what your
my
question is,
concern.
whether it's enough to support it.
Ms. Morantz.
Well, I was fortunate enough to be on the committee that studied this prior to the last group, and we had an opportunity to see some of the facilities. And I've always been a proponent of doing a convention center in Mason City. just two issues. I think we certainly need to have a feasibility study. I think you can't really move forward without having the experts do that type of work. And I also would be very much in favor of doing it somewhere in the downtown area and not putting it out on the outskirts of town.
Thank you. Who else? Ms. Silbert?
I kind of glancing through here, in regards to this lease, how long a time is that? I mean, is it 10 years, is it 15, 20?
What? The lease?
The lease, if you
We
bring
would
that,
negotiate
I'm
that.
just curious where that's at. Oh, and
Probably
that's
the maximum
negotiable?
time would
Okay.
be 30 years, I would think. And we would probably do 20. Kevin said it'd probably be 20.
Okay.
Part of that is too, if we're utilizing TIF funds, we're gonna pay a little more upfront. The later years in the TIF, we're gonna reduce that amount, based on the districts that will expire. So, but yeah, typically you wouldn't go, well, you wouldn't wanna go beyond 20, would you?
But just in being involved in hockey as much as I have, it's huge all over. And you talk Missouri, I was in St. Joe, Missouri many times, you know, and staying in hotels and different things like that. And you talk about ice time being booked up from 6 in the morning till
10.
whenever. We were out on the ice for tournaments at 6 o'clock in the morning down in Waterloo, Iowa, because that's the only time we had for ice because the arena was so booked in. I've seen a lot of these arenas, they're great, you know, Rochester, Fargo. They did it right the first time, and I guess that's our, you know, where I'm gonna go at with this. Yes, feasibility study to see if it will work, but then, we need to have the time for the people with the 2 sheets of ice, I think, too. So, I wanna see a little bit more information here. Not quite sure whether I want, you know, the vote yet or not, I'm not.
No, I'm
I haven't
saying
really heard,
it
you know, the
ultimately-
citizens, you know, vote on that. We as hockey people spent a lot of money throughout the years, and I don't see it quitting anytime soon. It's really popular. And it's not just for hockey, I mean, it's for
No.
a lot of the other things too.
Well, and that's gonna be the challenge. I mean, I think we have a lot of ideas, and Venue Works seems to think that we could bring certain types of events here. But until we start testing the market, you know, until it's built, it'll take a while for it to really pick up, or people start seeing this facility as being a facility that is a facility of choice. And for me, I like the other idea I like is the potential to have regional type sporting events at the high school level at this location. So often when you have a big game, the arena's packed, you know, the gym's packed, you can't get in. And be able to bring it here on a neutral site would be pretty cool.
Do we have any idea how many events that we've lost out on revenue?
I have no idea.
Thank you, Ms. Silbert.
Just,
I'm sorry, Mr. Lee?
the Venue Works you said, was that in your cost or something?
Is what?
Venue Works, what is that
They're a
Something we hired to
management, they're a
manage.
management type company that recruits different types of performers to, you know, for facilities. And they manage, Venue Works also goes out and actually manages the whole facility. They can do both. They can help us with the recruitment of activities or events here, or they can actually manage the whole facility from start to finish and have the employees be employees of them and pay a lease fee to the city. So it can work in many ways, but
Was that in your other expenses? Their management
no,
fees, right?
I guess I didn't include that. That's one thing that I didn't include. The other expenses has some of that, but it's a smaller amount because Young Arena doesn't do as much of that, so their other expenses is reduced. And so I think we'd have to you probably have to make a little bit of adjustment there, but.
Mr. Cube?
First, thanks to you and staff and to the Citizens Task Force. I'm not sure, there's a few people here that were on that did a lot of that work. I very much appreciate that. For me, I'm looking at this from 2 sides: the construction, the upfront costs, what the effects that would have on our budget, and then the operational side, and if we can not operate in the red. And I appreciate the conservative numbers you brought forth, and I agree with Councilman Lee that I'll be looking at different outlets to get information from the public on this, because this isn't something that the six of us can sit up here and decide on our own. I really want to get public input as far as financing, their inputs as far as operations, and different ways that we can potentially utilize the facility. So I'm really looking to the public to get some input on this. The lease to own is very intriguing to me. I'm looking forward to learn more about that. I've read up on it. One thing at our goal setting session that I talked a lot about last night is for commercial and municipality to look into wind generation. This is something, when you talk about naming rights and as far as working with our utility company, as far as ways that, when you look at one of the highest operation costs, but not just labor, but the utilities, ways that we could work with Alliant potentially. And I've done some research on this on my own, as far as possibly looking at a wind innovation zone to possibly power a facility like this. This is a big if, but I think we need to put everything on the table if that could be a way to lower our operations costs, to look into renewable sources of energy to possibly to power a facility like this. So that's something I want to put on the table and want to get people's input. That would obviously put an increased cost on the upfront side of it, but we would definitely be looking at long-term gains as far as our operating side. And as far as feasibility study, I think I would look forward to seeing some numbers about what that would cost us, and then just hearing more from staff. And but this is very, very early stages, but I'm intrigued. I want to hear from the public and look at different ways that we can be more innovative and learn from different communities what they've done and how we can improve on those processes. And appreciate the work and look forward on moving forward with this.
Mr. Arnquist. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I've got three primary thoughts, but I need to build a foundation first. Could you go to the shot that showed the funding mechanism? It was about a third of the way into the presentation, give or take. Is that what you're looking for? Yeah, I think it is. Okay, my initial take, having read through what you provided us and the presentation that you've made, is I too am most intrigued by the lease to own and using TIF to fund that obligation. But there's quite a bit of caution that goes with that. With the lease to own, if after 5 years everything went to crap, could we walk away from it?
I think there are provisions in there, but I don't know how much the payout is.
Okay, and even there's really two costs to the taxpayer up here. One would be the debt service and the general obligation bonds, whatever the bond amount is. The other is TIF. And I agree in principle that it would be much more effective for us as a community to be using our TIF capacity on a project that's going to create growth. But we all have to understand that does have an impact on the general fund, and you've mentioned that. So I'm also a person that at this point is in favor of putting a project in front of the taxpayers, even if all of our projections for construction and operations would indicate that the taxpayers wouldn't be any money out of pocket. Because those are just going to be projections, and there's a chance those projections could be wrong, and so everybody has a stake in the project. For us to ever get to a point where we can put a project in front of the voters, we have to have really good information on what it would cost to build it and how we're going to finance it, and what it would cost to operate it, and how we're going to cover that cost. And to me, those costs should be projected out over the life of whatever our debt obligation is. If we're talking about a 20-year lease to own, we should run a projection that runs at least 20 years. In fact, it'd be nice to look at it for 25 years and see what's happening to the community once we actually own the thing. And so we're really looking at two 20 to 25-year projections, one for capital and one for operations, which brings us back to a feasibility study. I would agree that to get the kind of projections we're talking about for the operational side of the ledger, we need to have somebody that's in the business come in and do it. So I'm interested in what it would cost to do such a feasibility study and how we would fund it. And I think that that is the next logical step before we can have any kind of an intelligent conversation, even amongst ourselves. And obviously, we'd have to do an RFP for such a feasibility study. And then on the capital side, I can't help but wonder if we shouldn't be talking about a second RFP. I don't know that we could limit it to local architects and local architectural firms, but let's say for the sake of discussion, we actually end up building this thing sometime down the road. And if you think about the council meeting we had just a couple weeks ago, I very strongly believe that if this is a local project being funded by local people, local resources, we need to be using local architects. We need to be using local general contractors. We need to be using local trades contractors. Now, everybody's gonna have to be competitive, and there's mechanisms we can put in place for that. But that's the backdrop to wondering if we shouldn't be going out for a second RFP to local architectural firms to be working on zeroing in on the construction costs. Now, coincident with both efforts, staff needs to be figuring out the best way to finance this and then putting together the 20 to 25-year projections for us. And I think council needs to be comfortable with the results of both of those work products before we'd ever have anything we can put in front of the voters. I think that's a fairly lengthy and involved process. My personal hope would be that if we're serious about this project and it were a project and we move forward, we would be trying to target, if indeed we all agree we want to have this go to the voters, we'd be targeting the November election so that we could hit the general election where we know voter turnout's going to be high because it's a presidential election year, and we avoid the costs of a special election. Which brings us back to another unique problem that we need to figure out. And, well, yeah, and I'm assuming local option sales tax is gonna be a foregone conclusion. We would be crazy as a community not to approve local option sales tax. We're a retail hub. A lot of that retail local option sales tax dollars from outside of the community, which relieves the burden on those of us inside the community. We would be absolutely insane as a community not. I mean, if we can't sell that, then there's something going wrong. But the interesting problem that we have is we've got private investors in the community that have put options on property looking out for the interests of the community as a whole. Now, we haven't talked a lot about where we cite this, but I'm a very strong advocate of the project being downtown. And I believe that the project that we had the first presentation on from Berglund and Cram, in my opinion, is the best site. That's the site where we have the least amount of property to acquire, and any other potential project location is going to require more acquisitions, which is going to extend the duration of the project, which is going to add cost both in terms of that extension and in terms of property acquisition, and it will make these numbers skyrocket. Okay, so if we assume we're going to have a project before the voters in November at the soonest, I don't know when the options expire, but I know it's sooner than that. We have people that are putting money out of pocket. At some point in time, I also, and maybe this is a discussion we have at another point in time, but I feel like that if this is a project that ever moves forward, the city should have control of the property. I don't think private investors should ultimately have control of the property. I think the city needs to have control of the property. And one of the primary reasons is, when we get to the point in time that we actually do design on a real project, I think we need to build this project to where as anybody that wants to gets a crack at it. I don't think we can stack the deck for any one company over another because of who controls the property, because it's going to be a community project. Now, my hope would be that local architects would be able to work together and lock arms and come up with a coalition. Sure, nobody from outside of town comes in, but a lot of that's beyond our control. That's a whole lot. That's a whole lot of directions I just went, and I think I'll just be quiet now.
Ms. Moranis.
My concern about that timeframe, what you're talking about voting on November, is the length of time it takes for a feasibility study. Because typically they, even after you do the RFPs and you get somebody coming in here, it's a several month process because they do the interviews with the community and they do a lot of the gathering of information. So it takes several months for that to be completed. And then to be able to work through all of what you're talking about is having the public input and getting the information out to the public. I think that's very hopeful to have it all completed by November.
Aggressive.
I think that.
Very aggressive.
And there's another factor that's in this. I mean, there are, you know, hockey is at the end of the life cycle of the ice and apparatus. And they didn't want to hold out, as I understand it, this long, if I'm correct.
You're talking the fairgrounds?
Yeah, that's correct. They own, that's theirs. So, and they didn't want to wait this year. So if they stick it back in to the fairgrounds, I mean, there's other.
That's a good point. Do you think, have
That's
you
why I
talked
think
with
you're
anybody
trying-
that does feasibility studies, and do you think what I mean, if you back off of November for 2 months to do some kind of a public campaign and information Q&A, that puts us in September, and we need a month before that for a presentation to the council, which backs us up around August 1. Do we have time between March 1 and August 1 to get a feasibility study done?
I don't know. I don't know if anybody, staff has any idea. It doesn't seem feasible, doesn't seem possible to me. We know that there are, I mean, even the owner of the Van Nuys Heights facility has done some feasibility studies because he's in the business. He's built multiple facilities, and he actually showed us, he was working on a presentation that he was going to be making to one of the other Minneapolis suburbs regarding feasibility of them building a facility. And so he does them, but beyond that, I would assume there are plenty of companies that are interested in doing. Some architects probably even do feasibility studies themselves. So I gotta believe that there are a number of companies that we could approach, but I don't know. I don't have any tip on it.
Does Venue Works do that?
Let's try to keep it, no offense, but let's try to keep the conversation.
Would it be possible for you to make some contacts in the next week or two and find out what's a reasonable amount of time for a company to do a feasibility study for a project like this? Under the presupposition that we were gonna try to hit a November election. Yeah.
Exactly.
Kevin, you remember what,
And you
how
could at
long?
that point in time decide whether you want to
Actually, I got
actually.
this down here. I'm trying to remember, what's the timeline for submitting for an election? Is it about 6 weeks out? So we have to have we'd have to have it on our ballot language approved probably about 6-7 weeks out of when the election is. So that's the target that we really have to hit if we want to November days.
This is another question I had, so I had a couple other concerns. You know, last night's goal setting and priorities, if I'm not mistaken, this didn't pop up. But infrastructure, public safety was. And, you know, we talked here this an hour or two ago, possible police station or a fire station or a satellite station, keep the ISO rating down, and you know, I would really want to see some kind of discussion, cost benefit, how you want to talk about it between using TIF, or we also talked about a big, you know, certified shovel ready site. You know, how is this a higher priority than some of those? And these are concerns I have coming out kind of negative here, but these are some serious concerns I have regarding this. I want to go on record, basically, I got 3 little children, and I would love something like this, but there seems to be in today's age where we even talked about, we don't know what corporate taxes, revenues, and rollbacks and all that's gonna do to this community. We just talked about preparing us for the unknown future. And this is jumping full hog into that. Now, I'm okay with the feasibility study, but I don't wanna rush anything. But this is too big to rush anything.
Well, as I mentioned in my report, the biggest concern that I have is that if there is a change in the commercial tax rate, we might as well stop talking, because they're gonna cut any avenue we have, because this type of proposal requires us to make serious changes relative to what we do for our general fund budget. That's the cost that is associated with doing TIF. And so, we can absorb some of those changes. We have ways, Kevin and I have talked, where we could absorb $300,000 to $400,000 with adjusting cost increases to water rates, sewer rates, a lot of other things that are impacted by making some of those changes and adjusting salaries, streamlining things as much as we can. But if they do anything to the commercial rate, it takes really this is an end game, because we will not have the funds to be able to support this. Things have to stay where they are right now, taxing wise, for us to really be able to afford this.
Ms. Solberg?
I, along with the feasibility study, have some questions. Kind of leaning toward the leasing option here. And Scott had mentioned that he would like to see the city own the land, but is that possible on these
Yeah.
leasing options? And then the local contractors, I mean, if they're technically building the facility, or if
They would control some of that, but it could be negotiated. I mean, we would do the best we could to negotiate that as part of the deal. But they are a full-service company where we would tell them what we want, seating wise, whatever. They would hire the architect, they would hire the contractor, they would do everything. And all we're doing is prepared to write the check. But we established the parameters of the design, but then turn them loose to build it. Once it was completed, it met our specs that we established for them, we would begin the lease. And then we would write them the check every year to pay for the expense related for the agreement that we have. So we really lose some local control relative to the lease option.
And then, any idea how much a feasibility study would cost, and where is that money going to come from?
My understanding is that the last one was $75,000. So that was the last one. That was 2000.
Just out of curiosity, how would you fund it?
Well, TIF would be a possibility, although we have to approve. Right now, we don't have unified, with the unification of the TIF districts, we're including language that allows us to do public buildings. That language would need to get approved in order for us to utilize TIF money to pay for this, because we have to have first the idea that we would build this and be able to pay for it with TIF dollars in our program, which we're gonna do anyway, because we don't, it's a limiting factor right now, not having that included in our TIF districts, because we may have a desire that, I mean, some are doing it, some are getting in trouble for it, but, you know, if fire protection is critical to our business and industry in the community, it seems to be a reasonable option that if we're gonna look at building a fire station, that we would use a portion of our TIF funds to support it. They're paying property taxes and so forth, and that is a way for us to capture everybody's needs to support that. So, but, yeah, I mean, I would bet we're looking, based on the inflation, we're probably over 100,000, maybe 125 would be my guess. That's how I guess was the last one, so I played it a little bit when it came to building the structure down there, but.
Go ahead, Mr. Brown.
Well, I agree with John that this is way too big to try to go fast, and the more we talk, the less feasible November sounds, but, you know, the cost of a special election is what, about $10,000? And that's not very much relative to what we're
Well,
really
the
talking
project
about
is,
here, so.
yeah. And it would really focus the decision-making on the community and those that were in favor of it would get out, just similar to the library.
And, you know, I have a hard time getting excited about 75 to 100,000 for a feasibility study. I'd want a lot of public input just before I pulled the feasibility study trigger, which means maybe we need to have a meeting or two where we share this kind of information with the public, and they have more opportunities to give all of us feedback.
Right.
And we'll also give
And-
an
and,
opportunity
I mean-
to hear from hockey, whether they're even gonna wait. Because if they don't wait, you know what I mean, you're down to.
And that's 100,000 we could spend on roads that we just took out of the budget, so that's a big number.
But it shouldn't be too hard for me to work with staff, and we'll get you the numbers on what the estimated cost would be for a feasibility study. And, you know, the options, I think we need to talk about that, and how much it's gonna cost. I think $15,000-20,000 maybe, right in that neighborhood to secure those options, but I don't know that hard figure. I need to work with the private side and have them give me the figures and be able to pursue whether that, those options, we can secure those from them and lock up that area. And so I think that would be the next step too also, is to allow me to have some conversations with them and determine that number and the cost of the feasibility study. And that can then be interjected into the conversation you're having with the public about whether they support this particular project.
I would, just listening to the conversation, and I've just been scribbling here, but I would propose something along the lines of this for you guys to consider, maybe a minute, set something a baseline. Because I think everyone's kind of on the same page. Maybe what we do is we have staff explore the feasibility study, timeline, costs, funding, what we can get, you know, so council has an opportunity to make a decision as to whether they want to do it at whatever point in time in that process it would be. We figure out how back that timeline off for this election, and then also consider what the special election would be, so they have all the information at their fingertips. I don't think it would be incredibly difficult to start putting together at least rough projections on 20 to 25 years. I think Mr. Trump is absolutely right. It's very crucial for the community, when they're having the discussion, to be able to see what that will look like, or at least have an idea roughly what that will look like. I assume it will be conservative numbers. And then, of course, at the same time, have the private folks who have very, they put their money out there for the community, have engaged a conversation to at least find out where that's at, and so council has their potential options in front of them. And then maybe what we do is we have you report back, maybe at one, whatever council is, 2 weeks or a month. And at that point in time, let council ask a little bit of questions, and then we have round of public input. Let's find out. Let's hear from the folks whether they want us to do it or not. Because there's no question, you know, commercial property taxes are reduced. You know, every time, the more they're reduced, the less likely this is. Go ahead.
Well, then, doesn't that last comment lend itself towards waiting to commit on a feasibility study until the legislature?
And that's
starts?
exactly what I'm suggesting, is
Which-
let them get the information on how much it would cost,
Okay.
you know, timeline on the feasibility study, then we're waiting on
Which
the
means November's
legislature.
really not.
It's
probably-
not a
it's not
tangible
feasible.
option. It's not a tangible option. But then we should also be having conversations with hockey to find out whether,
Oh, yeah.
if they pull the trigger, then we're also at the same
No.
place we're at. And at least get their view on what it looks like.
But realistically, with the timeline we're talking about just for decision-making, even if we ever move forward, we're 2.5 years away from a sheet of ice.
Yeah.
And so youth hockey needs to know that, the fairgrounds needs to
No,
know
and
that.
they do, and I don't know if does there happen to be anybody from youth hockey represented there? So you guys will track that down and get with Mr. Bergman there.
Do we know for sure Waldorf would be a partner?
Yes.
They've committed.
They want to play hockey in Iowa, not Minnesota. If they're an Iowa school, they want to play Iowa.
Is Nyack gonna have a team?
Nyack has discussed the potential of a team, but for right now, there's no viable option for them because there's no ice. So they have a lot of individuals that like to play, and they play in the little leagues that they have out there, but it's not a viable option for them to really get too serious about a team.
Sure.
There's no ice.
So I've kind of put a proposal out there. I felt like I saw head nods initially around the table. Does anyone have any concerns, amendments? And then we'll make sure Mr. Trout feels like he has what he needs from us to move forward. Mr. Kim?
I agree with all that. I would just add, what I was talking about before for staff, and I would love to be part of this, talking, as part of our franchise agreement, working with our utility provider of ways that we could use, it's a big if, and it's way down the road, but ways to limit our operations costs by using renewable sources of
Well,
utilities for our.
When we met with Tom Hurd, he had plenty of ideas with regards to how we could mold some of those ideas in, and I'm sure Randy and maybe Ted, if they were to get into it, look at some of those options for us too, but Tom had a few ideas, you know, solar, wind, different things that would be potentials. You know, you're talking about a big facility with a big roof, what are you gonna put on top of it? Obviously, there are complications when you do that, but, you know, exploring those potentials.
Because that's the side, for me, hypothetically, this does get built, the operations side, I mean, I very much appreciate the numbers you guys put forward, but I mean, that's gonna vary. If we had a guaranteed source of energy, I think that's something that could limit our operations side and be a potential to, you know, if we're getting real close, make this work. So I just wanna make sure we don't pass up that opportunity to research that side of it.
And just for your information, Trish and I have an agreement that she can never leave Mason City until we have a wind generator supplying energy to public buildings.
But my office may end up being on the roof.
That's going on right now, 8 years? 10?
Well, no, actually, that discussion, that's at 6.5. Yeah.
All right, anybody else here? You feel like you have what you need? All right, thank you very much. Your staff did a great job, and we appreciate the information. Go or no go, you need to have the information. Citizens know. Seeing nothing else on the agenda, we're adjourned.